I stood in my tiny living room while my parents actually laughed at the life they thought I'd failed into. My mother mocked the peeling paint, my father shook his head in disappointment, and my sister filmed it like it was entertainment. They didn't know I owned the entire building, including the penthouse right above their heads. And tonight, I was done being their joke. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or situations is purely coincidental. The day my own family called me a failure started with a message I almost didn't open. My mother's name lit up my phone screen after weeks of silence, and for a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the notification like it might burn me. "We're coming to visit today," it read, followed by a smiling emoji that felt more like a warning than anything warm. No question, no courtesy. Just a decision. Like my life was still something they could walk into whenever they felt like judging it. I looked around my apartment instinctively, as if seeing it through their eyes. The space was small, barely enough to hold the furniture I had carefully chosen piece by piece over the years. The couch was secondhand but clean, the walls plain but not dirty, the kitchen compact but functional. To me it was stability. It was independence. It was proof that I had survived without them. But to my family, I already knew what it would be. Evidence that I hadn't lived up to their expectations. Growing up, I was never the one they were proud of. My sister had been the golden child. The one who fit perfectly into the image my parents wanted to present to the world. She had the grades, the charm, the confidence that came from always being told she was enough. I had questions, doubts, and a stubborn streak that didn't sit well with their need for control. Every choice I made that didn't align with their plans became another reason for them to shake their heads and sigh like I was some kind of disappointment they couldn't fix. When I left home, it wasn't dramatic. There was no big fight, no shouting, no slammed doors. Just a quiet understanding that I didn't belong there anymore. They had made it clear in 100 small ways that I wasn't what they wanted, and I had finally stopped trying to be. I packed my things, found the cheapest place I could afford, and started over with nothing but determination and a promise to myself that I would never go back. The years that followed weren't easy. There were nights I skipped meals to make rent, mornings I woke up exhausted but forced myself to keep going. Days when rejection piled up so heavily it felt impossible to breathe. But I kept pushing. I learned how to navigate a world that didn't care about me, how to build something out of nothing, how to rely on myself when there was no one else to lean on. Every small victory mattered, even if no one was there to celebrate it. My family, meanwhile, stayed distant, but watchful in their own way. They never asked how I was doing, but they always seemed to know enough to form opinions. Through relatives and social media snippets, they pieced together a version of my life that fit their narrative. To them, I was still struggling, still lost, still the daughter who had walked away and failed to prove them wrong. They didn't see the late nights, the risks, the quiet progress that didn't look impressive from the outside. So when they decided to visit, it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like an inspection. I spent the hours before they arrived cleaning a space that was already clean, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, as if I could somehow prepare for the judgment I knew was coming. Part of me wanted to cancel, to make an excuse and avoid the entire situation. But another part, the stronger part, told me to let them come. Let them see what they thought my life was. Let them believe it. When the knock finally came, it was sharp and impatient. I opened the door to the same faces I had spent years trying to forget, and for a split second, something inside me tightened. My mother stepped in first, her eyes scanning everything with a critical precision that hadn't changed at all. My father followed, his expression already set in quiet disapproval. My sister lingered behind them, her phone casually in her hand, like she was ready to capture something amusing. They didn't greet me properly. There were no hugs, no warmth, just quick, polite words that felt empty before they even landed. Within seconds, their attention shifted entirely to the apartment. My mother touched the edge of the table like she was testing its worth. My father looked up at the ceiling, then around the room as if calculating all the ways I had fallen short. My sister smirked, her eyes flicking between me and the space like she had already made up her mind. "This is where you live?" my mother asked, her tone light but cutting. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, even as I felt the familiar weight of their judgment settling over me. "It's small," my father added, not even trying to soften it. My sister let out a quiet laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be hidden. "I mean, I guess it's what we expected," she said, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. Each comment landed exactly where it always had, in that place I had spent years trying to heal. But this time, something was different. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself, to explain, to prove anything. I just stood there, listening, letting them reveal exactly who they still were. Because for the first time, their words didn't define me anymore. Their cruel visit didn't begin with shouting or open insults. It was quieter than that, sharper in a way that felt more deliberate. The kind of cruelty that hides behind polite smiles and casual observations, the kind that makes you question whether you're overreacting even while it's cutting you apart. They walked through my apartment like they were touring a place they had already decided wasn't worth much, their eyes catching every imperfection, every detail they could turn into a subtle criticism. My mother moved first, drifting toward the kitchen with slow, measured steps, her fingers brushing against the counter as if she were checking for dust. "You really should invest in better cabinets," she said lightly, opening one without asking. "These look like they'll fall apart any day." She closed it with a small shake of her head, like she was disappointed but not surprised. My father lingered near the window, glancing out at the street below before turning back to me. "This area isn't exactly ideal," he commented, his tone calm but firm, as if he were stating a fact I should have already been ashamed of. "You could have done better if you'd planned things properly." I felt the familiar tension creeping up my spine, but I kept my face still. It wasn't new. It was the same script, just a different setting. My sister, meanwhile, made herself comfortable on the couch, crossing her legs and leaning back like she owned the place. Her phone was still in her hand, her thumb scrolling lazily before she angled the camera slightly, capturing bits of the apartment without even trying to hide it. "It's kind of cute," she said, drawing the word out just enough to make it sound like an insult, in a temporary kind of way. Temporary. That word echoed louder than the rest. I watched them spread out, each of them finding a way to claim space while making it clear none of it impressed them. They didn't ask how I had been, didn't show any real interest in my life. Every question they asked felt like it had an answer they were already expecting, and anything that didn't fit that expectation was quickly dismissed. "So what exactly do you do now?" my father asked, finally sitting down but keeping his posture rigid. "I work in property management," I replied simply. He raised an eyebrow, exchanging a brief glance with my mother. "Management," he repeated, like the word itself was questionable. "That sounds vague." "It means I handle properties," I said, keeping my tone even. My sister let out a soft laugh, not even looking up from her phone. "So basically you take care of other people's buildings," she said. "That's actually kind of ironic." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My mother stepped back into the living room, folding her arms as she looked around again. "We always thought you'd do something more stable," she said. "Something with real growth." The implication was clear. This wasn't it. Their words weren't louder than before, but they were more coordinated, like they were building on each other's judgments, reinforcing the same idea from different angles. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about everything they believed my life had become. Then came the comparisons. "Your sister just got promoted again," my mother said casually, glancing toward her with a small, proud smile. "She's managing an entire team now." My sister looked up just long enough to shrug modestly, though the satisfaction in her eyes was obvious. "It's a lot of responsibility," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to make it sound impressive. "But I guess I've always been good at handling pressure." My father nodded approvingly. "That's what happens when you stay focused," he added, his gaze shifting back to me in a way that didn't need words to finish the thought. I felt the old pattern settling in the comparison. The quiet competition I had never agreed to, but was always forced into. For years, I had tried to win their approval, to prove that I could be just as worthy, just as successful. But standing there now, listening to them repeat the same narrative, I realized they had never been interested in seeing me differently. To them, I had already been defined. My sister stood up after a while, stretching slightly before walking toward the hallway. "Is this the only bedroom?" she asked, peeking inside without waiting for an answer. "Wow. It's even smaller than I thought. It's enough for me," I said. She turned back, tilting her head as she studied me. "You've really lowered your standards," she said, her tone almost curious. "I don't know how you're okay with this." That was the moment something shifted, not outwardly. I didn't raise my voice or argue. But inside, there was a quiet, steady change. The kind that doesn't explode all at once, but settles in with certainty. They weren't here to understand me. They weren't here to reconnect or rebuild anything. This visit wasn't about family. It was about validation. They had come to confirm their beliefs, to see with their own eyes that I was exactly where they thought I would be, and in their minds, I hadn't disappointed them. I had proven them right. My mother picked up her bag after a while, glancing at the time like she had somewhere better to be. "We shouldn't stay too long," she said. "We just wanted to check in." Check in. As if this had been a casual, caring visit. My father stood as well, straightening his jacket. "You should think about your future more seriously," he said. "This isn't sustainable." My sister gave me one last look, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "But hey," she added lightly, "at least you're independent, right?" They moved toward the door, leaving behind the same air they had brought with them, heavy, dismissive, final. I walked them out, without protest, without trying to change their minds. I didn't stop them, didn't ask them to stay, didn't defend anything they had criticized. I just watched as they stepped back into the hallway, already moving on from me like I was just another stop in their day. The door closed with a soft click, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt louder than anything they had said. Then, I exhaled slowly, looking around the apartment again. Not through their eyes this time, but my own. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the silence in my apartment settled like a calm after a storm that had been building for years. I stood there for a while, staring at the same walls they had just criticized, the same space they had reduced to something temporary and insignificant. But now that they were gone, it felt different again. Steady, controlled, mine. Their voices still echoed faintly in my head, but they no longer carried the same weight. Instead, they sounded distant, almost irrelevant. I turned toward the hallway slowly, my gaze drifting to the one thing they hadn't questioned, the one detail they had completely overlooked. The old wooden door at the end of the corridor. It didn't look like much, slightly worn, the paint chipped in places, the handle simple and unremarkable. To anyone else, it was just a storage room, or maybe a maintenance closet. To them, it hadn't even been worth a second glance. But that door was the line between the life they believed I was living and the reality I had built in silence. I walked toward it with measured steps, each one grounded in a truth I had protected for years. My fingers brushed against the surface before I reached for the handle, feeling the familiar texture beneath my palm. There was something almost symbolic about how ordinary it looked. That had always been the point. Nothing about my success was meant to be obvious. Not yet. When I turned the handle, the mechanism clicked smoothly, revealing a narrow staircase hidden behind it. The lighting was soft but sufficient, casting a quiet glow up the steps that led higher into the building. This wasn't an emergency exit or some neglected back passage. It was private, secured, and intentionally placed something only I had access to. Something only I knew how to use. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, sealing off the version of my life my family thought they understood. The air felt different here, lighter somehow, as if I had crossed into a space where their opinions couldn't reach. The staircase rose steadily, each step carrying me further away from the small apartment they had judged and closer to the truth they had completely missed. This building wasn't just where I lived. It was something I had claimed piece by piece, quietly and strategically. While they assumed I was barely getting by, I had been studying the market, taking risks they would have called reckless, and making decisions that didn't pay off immediately but built something far more powerful over time. Every contract, every late night of negotiation, every moment of doubt I had pushed through it, had all led here. At the top of the staircase, another door waited, starkly different from the one below. Sleek, modern, secured with a system that required more than just a simple key. I entered the code without hesitation, the panel lighting up briefly before granting access. The door opened with a soft, controlled motion, revealing a space that existed in complete contrast to everything my family had just seen. The penthouse stretched out before me, wide and open, filled with natural light that poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline framed the view, a constant reminder of how far I had come from the version of myself they still believed in. The design was clean, intentional, every detail chosen with care. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a statement, a culmination of years of quiet effort that no one had witnessed. I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me. And for a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. Not because it was new, but because it grounded me. It reminded me that everything they had said downstairs was based on an illusion I had allowed them to see. They had laughed at the apartment, dismissed my work, compared me to a version of success that fit their expectations, but they had no idea they were standing inside a building that belonged entirely to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had walked through the space I had deliberately kept modest, judged it without hesitation, and left feeling confirmed in their beliefs. Meanwhile, the truth had been just a few steps away, hidden behind a door they hadn't even noticed. I moved further into the penthouse, my footsteps soft against the polished floor. There was no rush, no urgency. I wasn't hiding anymore, not from myself. The secret I had carried for so long wasn't a burden. It was a choice. A strategy. I had never needed their approval to build what I wanted. In fact, their absence had made it easier. Without their constant scrutiny, I had been free to make mistakes, to learn, to grow in ways they would have never supported. I paused near the windows, looking out over the city below. Somewhere down there, my family was probably still talking, still convinced they understood exactly who I was and what my life had become. They would go back to their routines, their conversations filled with subtle judgments and confident assumptions. To them, nothing had changed. But everything had. The secret I hid behind that broken door wasn't just about wealth or property. It was about control over my own narrative. For years they had defined me as the one who fell short, the one who walked away and failed to prove them wrong. And I had let them believe it, not because it was true, but because it gave me the freedom to build something without interference. I reached for the glass, resting my hand lightly against it as I looked down at the building from above. From this height, the difference between perception and reality felt almost surreal. The small apartment they mocked was just one layer of a much larger picture they couldn't see. And soon, they wouldn't be able to ignore it anymore. Years of silence weren't something I chose because it was easy. They were something I accepted because every time I had tried to speak before, I had been talked over, corrected, or dismissed. Silence, over time, became my strategy. It gave me space to observe, to think, and most importantly, to act without interference. While my family filled the distance with assumptions about my failure, I used that same distance to rebuild myself in ways they would never understand. In the beginning, it didn't feel like a strategy at all. It felt like survival. After I left home, there were no safety nets, no backup plans, no reassuring voices telling me I would be okay. There were only responsibilities that came faster than I was ready for, and consequences that didn't wait for me to catch up. Every decision mattered, even the smallest ones. What I spent, where I worked, who I trusted, each choice carried weight, and there was no one to help me carry it. I worked jobs that didn't align with what I had once imagined for myself. Positions that were repetitive, exhausting, and often overlooked by people who thought ambition only existed in titles and degrees. But those jobs taught me something far more valuable than recognition. They taught me how systems worked from the ground up. I learned how businesses operated behind the scenes, how money flowed, where inefficiencies hid, and how people made decisions when they thought no one important was watching. At night, when everything quieted down, I studied. Not in a classroom, not with structured lessons, but on my own terms. I read contracts I'd barely understood at first, researched markets that felt overwhelming, and taught myself how to see patterns in numbers and behavior. It was slow, frustrating work. There were moments when nothing made sense, when I questioned whether I was wasting time chasing something too far out of reach. But I kept going because stopping would have meant proving every doubt they ever had about me was right. Sacrifice became a constant companion. I said no to things other people my age didn't think twice about. Nights out, vacations, unnecessary spending, each one was a choice I couldn't afford if I wanted something bigger later. I lived in smaller spaces than I needed, wore things longer than I should have, and learned to stretch every resource I had. It wasn't about deprivation. It was about discipline. Every short-term comfort I gave up created room for a long-term gain I was slowly building toward. The first real shift didn't come from luck. It came from a risk that most people would have avoided. I had saved enough to consider investing, but not enough to recover easily if things went wrong. That was the reality I had to face. There was no safety net waiting for me if I failed, but there was also no progress waiting for me if I didn't try. I studied the opportunity from every angle, questioned every assumption, and when I finally made the decision, I committed fully. It didn't pay off immediately. In fact, at first, it looked like I had made a mistake. The returns were slow, the process complicated, and the pressure constant. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had just undone years of careful planning with one decision. But instead of pulling back, I leaned in. I learned more, adjusted where I needed to, and refused to let uncertainty push me into retreat. That one step became the foundation for the next. Each experience added to my understanding. Each challenge refined my approach. I stopped looking at setbacks as failures and started seeing them as data. Information that could guide my next move instead of stopping it. Over time, the risks became more calculated, the decisions more precise. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was building. All the while, my family remained distant, but their influence never fully disappeared. Their voices lived in the back of my mind, not as authority, but as a reminder of what I was working against. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I remembered the way they used to look at me, the quiet disappointment, the lack of belief. Instead of breaking me, it sharpened my focus. I didn't need their approval anymore, but I wasn't going to ignore the impact they had either. I turned it into fuel. There were moments when I could have reached out, when I could have shared small victories, or asked for acknowledgement. But I didn't. Not because I didn't want connection, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Validation from them would always come with conditions. It would always be tied to whether my success aligned with their expectations, and I wasn't building my life to fit their definition anymore. So I stayed silent, not invisible, not inactive, just silent. I let my actions speak in ways they couldn't hear yet. I let time create distance between who they thought I was and who I was becoming. And in that space, I found clarity. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong anymore. I was proving to myself that I could create something stable, something powerful, something entirely my own. As the years passed, the sacrifices began to show results that were no longer small or subtle. Opportunities started to connect. Decisions carried more weight, and the structure I had been building quietly started to take shape. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't sudden. It was the accumulation of every disciplined choice, every calculated risk, every moment I chose to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. By the time my family walked into my apartment and saw what they believed was my reality, they were looking at a version of my life that no longer defined me. They were reacting to a surface I had carefully maintained, unaware of everything that existed beneath it. The years of silence, sacrifice, and strategy hadn't just changed my circumstances. They had changed me. How I built my empire, without their name, wasn't a single breakthrough moment, or a lucky opportunity that changed everything overnight. It was a process that unfolded quietly, shaped by decisions no one applauded and risks no one encouraged. The absence of their name wasn't a disadvantage the way they always claimed it would be. In many ways, it became my greatest leverage. Without their influence, I wasn't confined to their expectations, their methods, or their limitations. I was forced to figure things out on my own, and in doing so, I learned how to build something that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. The first thing I understood was that credibility doesn't always come from where people think it does. My family believed success was tied to reputation, connections, and being recognized by the right people. But I learned that value could be created in quieter ways, in places they would have overlooked. I started small, taking opportunities others ignored because they didn't seem impressive enough. Properties that needed work. Deals that required patience. Situations that demanded attention to detail rather than immediate payoff. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. I didn't introduce myself with a last name that carried weight. I didn't have doors open for me or shortcuts offered. Instead, I showed up prepared. I asked questions others didn't think to ask. I paid attention to the details people rushed past. Over time, that consistency started to matter more than any connection I could have borrowed. People began to trust my judgment, not because of where I came from, but because of what I consistently delivered. There were moments when I saw exactly how different my path was from the one my family would have chosen for me. They would have pushed for visibility, for recognition, for positions that looked impressive on the surface. But I focused on control, ownership, understanding the structure behind every decision I made. I didn't want to just participate in systems. I wanted to understand them well enough to shape them. The deals I took on weren't always obvious wins. Some of them required long-term commitment, with results that wouldn't show for months or even years. That kind of patience wasn't something my family ever valued. They preferred outcomes that could be measured quickly, compared easily, and displayed publicly. But I learned to measure success differently, not by how it looked in the moment, but by what it would become over time. There were setbacks, situations where I miscalculated, trusted the wrong person, or underestimated the complexity of what I was stepping into. Without a safety net, every mistake had consequences I had to face directly. But those moments didn't break me the way my family might have expected. They forced me to adapt, to refine how I assessed risk, how I negotiated, how I protected what I was building. I became more precise with my decisions, more selective with my time and energy. I stopped chasing opportunities that didn't align with a larger strategy, even if they looked appealing on the surface. Every move had to serve a purpose beyond immediate gain. That discipline created a kind of momentum that wasn't visible from the outside, but it was powerful. Each step built on the last, creating a structure that grew stronger with time. One of the most important shifts came when I realized I didn't need recognition to validate my progress. My family had always tied success to being seen, to being acknowledged by others. But I found a different kind of confidence in building things that spoke for themselves, even if no one else knew the full story. The results were there, whether they were recognized or not. As my portfolio grew, so did my understanding of how to leverage it. I wasn't just accumulating assets. I was learning how to connect them, how to use one success to support the next. It became less about individual wins, and more about creating a system that could sustain itself. A system that didn't depend on constant attention or approval, but operated with its own internal logic. I also learned the value of anonymity in a way my family never could. By not being associated with their name, I avoided the assumptions that came with it. People didn't expect anything from me beyond what I showed them. That gave me the freedom to exceed expectations quietly, without pressure to perform in a specific way. It allowed me to move strategically, without drawing attention to moves that were still in progress. There were times when I imagined what it would be like if they could see what I was doing, if they understood the complexity, the effort, the discipline behind every decision. But those thoughts didn't last long. because I knew even if they saw it, they would filter it through their own perspective. They would try to reshape it into something that fit their narrative. And I had no interest in letting them do that. Everything I built on my own terms. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could create something independent of them. Something that didn't rely on their validation, their resources, or their approval. By the time my family stood in my apartment, looking around with quiet judgment and misplaced confidence, they were standing inside a fraction of what I had created. They saw the surface and assumed it was the whole picture. They didn't realize that the building itself, every floor, every unit, every detail they overlooked, was part of something far larger than they could imagine. And the name on every contract wasn't theirs. The invitation they never expected to receive wasn't sent in anger or impulse. It was calculated, timed, and deliberate, in a way that reflected everything I had learned over the years. I didn't rush it the moment they walked out of my apartment. I let a few days pass, enough for them to settle back into their version of my life, enough for their assumptions to solidify again. I wanted them comfortable in their beliefs, certain that nothing had changed, certain that they had seen everything there was to see. When I finally drafted the message, I kept it simple. No long explanations, no emotional undertones, nothing that hinted at what was coming. I'm hosting a small gathering this weekend. It would mean a lot if you came. That was it. Neutral, almost understated. The kind of message they wouldn't overanalyze, because it fit perfectly into the version of me they had already constructed. To them it probably sounded like an attempt to reconnect, maybe even an effort to impress them with something small I was proud of. I knew exactly how they would interpret it. My mother replied first, quicker than I expected. "We'll see if we're available," she wrote, followed by a comment about how busy things had been lately. It wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes either. It was the same controlled distance she always maintained, as if committing too quickly would give me more importance than she was willing to offer. My father didn't respond directly. He never did. If he had something to say, it usually came through my mother, filtered and adjusted to fit whatever tone she thought was appropriate. My sister, on the other hand, sent a short message hours later. "What kind of gathering?" she asked, the curiosity in her words subtle but noticeable. I replied just as briefly, "Just something small. You'll see." That was enough. Over the next couple of days, I didn't follow up. I didn't remind them, didn't push for confirmation. I let the invitation sit there, giving them the space to decide on their own. That was part of the strategy. If they came, it would be because they chose to. And if they chose to come, they would walk in with the same mindset they always had, confident, dismissive, convinced they understood everything. By the time the weekend arrived, my mother finally confirmed. "We'll stop by for a little while," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. My sister added a message of her own. Something light and slightly teasing about hoping this was worth the trip. My father, as expected, remained silent. I read their responses without reacting. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. Preparing for the gathering wasn't about decoration or presentation in the way they would assume. It wasn't about impressing them with something flashy or overdone. It was about control, every detail, every moment, every reveal planned with precision. I coordinated with people who understood discretion, who knew how to follow instructions without asking unnecessary questions. The guest list was intentional, made up of individuals who were part of the world I had built. People who respected what I had created without needing to announce it loudly. I made sure everything was set in place above, in the penthouse, while leaving my apartment exactly as it had been. That contrast was important. It was the foundation of everything that would follow. I didn't want any hints, no early signs that something was different. When they arrived, I wanted them to feel the same quiet confidence in their judgment they had carried during their last visit. As the time approached, I found myself standing in the same living room they had mocked, looking around with a clarity that felt almost detached. This space had served its purpose. It had been the version of my life they could understand, the one they could judge without questioning their own assumptions. Tonight, it would become something else entirely, a starting point. There was no nervousness, no hesitation. If anything, there was a calm certainty that settled in, the kind that comes when every variable has been accounted for. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't defending myself or trying to prove anything in the moment. This wasn't about convincing them with words. It was about showing them a reality they had refused to imagine. When the knock finally came, it was familiar in its rhythm, the same sharp, impatient sound from before. I opened the door to the same expressions, the same energy they carried with them like it was permanent. My mother stepped in first again, her eyes already scanning the room. Her posture relaxed in that particular way that suggested she expected nothing to surprise her. My father followed, his gaze steady, unchanged. My sister walked in last, her attention split between the room and her phone, as if she was already preparing to document something mildly amusing. "You didn't change much," my mother noted almost immediately, her tone neutral but edged with quiet judgment. "I didn't need to," I replied, keeping my voice even. They moved through the apartment the same way they had before, their reactions predictable, almost rehearsed. It was as if the last visit had simply confirmed everything they believed, leaving no room for reconsideration. They didn't ask many questions this time. They didn't need to. In their minds, they already had the answers. "So this is the gathering?" my sister asked after a moment, glancing around with a faint smile. "It's cozy." "It's not here," I said. That caught their attention, just enough to shift the atmosphere slightly. My father looked at me more directly, his expression tightening with curiosity he didn't bother to hide. My mother tilted her head, as if trying to reassess something she hadn't considered before. My sister lowered her phone just a little, her interest sharpening. "Then where?" my mother asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I turned toward the hallway, toward the door they had ignored before. I let the moment stretch just long enough for the question to settle, for their curiosity to deepen without giving them anything to hold on to yet. "Upstairs," I said finally, my tone calm, almost casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The moment I turned toward the hidden door and told them we were going upstairs, I felt the shift before I even saw it. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a slight hesitation in their movements, a pause that didn't belong to them. For people who always carried certainty so effortlessly, even a moment of uncertainty was noticeable. My mother's expression tightened just enough to betray her curiosity. My father's posture straightened like he was preparing to assess something unfamiliar. And my sister finally lowered her phone completely, her attention no longer divided. I walked ahead without looking back, reaching the door at the end of the hallway and opening it with the same calm precision I had practiced 100 times before. The narrow staircase revealed itself again, lit softly, leading upward in a way that felt both ordinary and significant. To me, it had always been a passage between two realities. To them, it was something entirely unexpected. "There's more?" my sister asked, her voice lighter than usual but edged with something she hadn't felt before, uncertainty. "Just follow me," I said. They did. I could hear their footsteps behind me as we moved up the stairs, slower than mine, more cautious. The confidence they had carried into my apartment didn't fit as easily here. This wasn't a space they had already judged, and without that advantage, they had to adjust. I didn't rush the moment. Each step was deliberate, each second allowed to stretch just enough for their questions to build without answers. Halfway up, my mother spoke again, unable to hold back. "Why didn't you mention this before?" she asked, her tone carefully controlled, but no longer dismissive. I didn't turn around. "You didn't ask," I replied simply. That answer lingered behind me, quiet but heavy. It wasn't just about the staircase. It was about everything they had never asked, everything they had assumed instead of understanding. When we reached the top, I stopped in front of the second door, the one that contrasted so sharply with everything below. Sleek, modern, secure. It didn't belong to the version of my life they thought they knew. I entered the code without hesitation, the soft beep echoing in the narrow space before the lock released. I opened the door and stepped inside first. The light hit immediately, spilling across the floor, stretching into the open space beyond. I moved forward just enough to clear the entrance, then stepped aside without saying a word. They followed. For a moment, there was nothing. No comments, no questions, no immediate reactions. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from disinterest, but from impact. The kind that happens when reality doesn't align with expectation so completely that it takes time to process. My mother was the first to step fully into the space, her eyes moving across the room slowly, as if she needed to confirm what she was seeing piece by piece. The confidence that had defined her downstairs was gone, replaced with something far more cautious. My father remained near the entrance for a second longer, his gaze fixed ahead, calculating, reassessing. My sister stood just behind him, her usual composure replaced with something closer to disbelief, her phone still in her hand, but forgotten. "This," my mother started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I didn't help her. They moved further in, almost unconsciously, drawn by the scale of the space, the light, the view that stretched beyond the windows. The city looked different from up here. Distant in a way that changed perspective. Everything they had just seen below felt smaller, less significant, like it belonged to a completely different story. My father finally stepped forward, his eyes scanning the details with a level of attention he had never given my apartment. This time, he wasn't looking for flaws. He was trying to understand. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the quiet authority it usually carried. "It's mine," I said. The words were simple, but they didn't land lightly. My sister turned to me fully then, her expression searching my face like she was looking for a sign that this was some kind of exaggeration, some detail she had misunderstood. "You mean you live here?" she asked. "I own it," I corrected. Another silence followed, heavier this time. I watched them absorb it, each in their own way. My mother's composure wavered, her eyes returning to the space around her as if seeing it again would somehow change what it meant. My father's expression tightened, not with disapproval this time, but with the strain of recalculating something he had been so certain about. My sister's disbelief didn't disappear, it shifted, turning into something sharper, something that carried the beginnings of realization. They walked further into the penthouse, slower now, more deliberate. The ease they had before was gone, replaced with a careful awareness of where they were and what it represented. Every step they took seemed to carry more weight than it should have, as if the space itself demanded it. "You didn't tell us," my mother said finally, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I met her gaze without hesitation. "You didn't want to know," I replied. That truth settled between us, undeniable. They looked around again, but this time, it wasn't with judgment. It was with recognition, even if they hadn't fully accepted it yet. The narrative they had built about me was breaking apart, piece by piece, replaced by something they hadn't prepared for. And for the first time since they walked into my life again, they didn't know what to say. Their faces didn't change all at once. It wasn't a dramatic shock or some instant realization that played out in a single moment. It happened gradually, like something cracking beneath the surface, spreading slowly until it couldn't be ignored anymore. I watched it unfold in silence, taking in every detail with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. My mother was the easiest to read. She had always relied on control, on knowing exactly how to respond, how to maintain her composure, how to keep everything within a narrative that made sense to her. But now, standing in the middle of a space she couldn't explain away, that control was slipping. Her eyes moved from one detail to another, not with judgment this time, but with calculation, as if she were trying to rebuild her understanding of me from the ground up. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly, almost to herself. It wasn't a question, it was a refusal. My father reacted differently. Where my mother tried to process, he resisted. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his posture remained rigid even as the certainty behind it weakened. He didn't like not understanding something, especially when it involved losing the authority he had always assumed he had over me. For him, this wasn't just surprising, it was destabilizing. You said you worked in property management, he said, his tone sharper now, like he was searching for a contradiction he could hold on to. I do, I replied calmly. He looked around again, slower this time, as if expecting the space itself to argue with me. This isn't management, he said. This is ownership. I held his gaze. Yes. That single word seemed to land heavier than anything else I had said. My sister, though, was the one who changed the most visibly. She had always been the one who turned everything into something light, something she could laugh at or dismiss. But there was no room for that here. The smirk she carried so easily downstairs was gone, replaced with something far less comfortable. Her eyes moved across the room, then back to me, then away again, like she didn't know where to settle. How? She asked finally, the word slipping out before she could dress it up in something less vulnerable. That question hung in the air longer than the others, not because I couldn't answer it, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the first crack in the certainty they had built around me. The first moment where they had to acknowledge that they didn't understand my life at all. I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence stretch, let them sit with the question instead of filling it immediately. You never asked, I said eventually. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the truth they needed to hear. My mother turned to me then, more directly than before. We're asking now, she said, her voice steadier, but no longer dismissive. I studied her for a moment, noticing the shift. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something closer to urgency. The need to regain control, to reestablish a sense of understanding that had been taken from her. But this wasn't a conversation I owed them anymore. You already decided what my life looked like, I said, keeping my tone even. You just didn't expect to be wrong. That landed harder than anything else. My father exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face in a gesture I had rarely seen from him. It wasn't frustration in the usual sense. It was something closer to disorientation, the kind that comes when something fundamental shifts and there's no immediate way to fix it. You should have told us, he said after a moment, but there was less conviction in it now. I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement but because of how predictable it was. Even now, the instinct was to place the responsibility back on me, to frame this as something I had failed to communicate rather than something they had failed to see. Would it have changed anything? I asked. He didn't answer, because we both knew it wouldn't have. My sister moved toward the window then, drawn by the view more than anything else. She stood there for a moment, looking out over the city, her reflection faint in the glass. When she turned back to me, something in her expression had shifted again, less disbelief, more awareness. This whole time, she started, then stopped, as if finishing the sentence would force her to fully accept it. Yes, I said quietly. She let out a breath, shaking her head slightly. We thought you were struggling, she admitted, the words coming slower now, without the confidence they used to carry. I know, I replied. That was the moment it fully settled. Not just the realization of what I had built, but the recognition of how wrong they had been. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It showed in the way they looked at me now, no longer with dismissal, no longer with quiet superiority, but with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. They walked through the space again, but this time it wasn't about assessing or judging. It was about understanding, even if they were still far from it. Every detail they had overlooked downstairs now carried a different meaning. Every assumption they had made was being questioned, piece by piece. And I stood there, watching it happen, not with anger or satisfaction, but with a calm detachment I had earned over years of being underestimated. Because for the first time in my life, they were the ones trying to catch up to me. Exposing every lie they told about me didn't happen the way people imagine revenge to happen. There was no sudden outburst, no raised voices echoing through the penthouse, no dramatic confrontation where everything collapsed at once. It was slower, more controlled, almost surgical. Because the truth was, they had never told one big lie about me. They had built a version of me out of small assumptions, repeated often enough that they became fact in their minds. Standing there in that space, watching them struggle with what they were seeing, I realized something important. I didn't need to attack their lies. I only needed to place reality beside them and let the contrast do the work. My mother was still the first to try to regain footing. She adjusted her tone carefully, like she was stepping into unfamiliar territory, but still trying to maintain authority. "We never said you couldn't succeed," she said slowly, choosing each word with caution. "We just thought you were struggling." That sentence revealed more than she intended. I turned slightly toward her. "You didn't think I was struggling," I said calmly. "You decided I was." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she didn't have a ready correction. My father stepped forward, trying to anchor the situation back into something logical. "If this is yours," he said, gesturing around the penthouse, "then why hide it?" That question carried the assumption they had always held that anything valuable must be displayed, announced, validated by others. "I didn't hide it," I replied. "I just didn't share it with people who already made up their minds about me." That hit differently. I saw it in the way his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger this time, but in discomfort, because it removed the idea that he had been entitled to know. My sister, meanwhile, was quieter now, but her silence wasn't passive, it was processing. She looked between me and the space again, as if trying to reconcile the version of me she had laughed at with the reality she was standing inside. "You let us think you were failing," she said finally, her voice lower, less confident than before. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of her words sit there, because even that sentence contained another assumption, one that placed responsibility on me for their perception. "You didn't need my permission to believe whatever you wanted," I said at last. That was the first real break, not a dramatic confrontation, but a shift in accountability, because suddenly, they couldn't frame this as something I had done to them. The stories they had built weren't based on information I gave them. They were based on what they chose to see. My mother's expression tightened slightly. "We were told you left without direction," she said almost defensively. "That you were jumping from job to job, barely managing rent." She stopped mid-sentence, as if realizing how thin that explanation sounded in this space. I nodded slowly. "And you believed it," I said. There was no accusation in my voice, just confirmation. My father looked away for a moment, toward the view again, but I could tell he wasn't seeing it anymore. He was replaying things in his mind, trying to reconstruct the narrative that had led them here. "We heard things," he said finally. "From family, from relatives. You never corrected them." That was the core of it. The lies weren't loud or malicious at first. They were fragments passed through distance, assumptions repeated until they hardened into certainty. And because I didn't engage, didn't defend myself, those fragments became the only version of me they knew. "I didn't correct them," I said, "because I wasn't living my life for their approval either." That answer created another silence, but this one was different. Less defensive, more unsettled. My sister walked a few steps further into the room, then stopped again. "So everything we thought," she started, then hesitated. "It wasn't true." I turned to her fully now. "Some of it was convenient," I said. "For you. That was the hardest part for them to hear. Not that they were wrong, but that they had benefited from being wrong. My failure had made their success easier to define. My absence had made their achievements feel more meaningful. My supposed struggle had given them something to compare themselves against, without ever questioning the accuracy of the comparison." My mother sat down slowly on the edge of one of the chairs, like her body needed time to catch up with what her mind was processing. "We didn't know," she said again. But it sounded different now. Less like a statement, more like something she was trying to convince herself of. "You didn't want to know," I corrected gently. She didn't argue, because there was no version of events where they had made an effort to understand me beyond surface assumptions. They had filled in the gaps with convenience, not curiosity. My father finally spoke again, quieter this time. All this time you were building this? Yes, I said simply. He nodded slowly, but it wasn't agreement. It was acceptance of something that no longer needed his validation to exist. My sister looked at me again, and this time there was no smirk left anywhere in her expression. We told people you left without anything, she admitted. We thought you were trying to prove something you couldn't. That was the final layer. Not just misunderstanding, but narrative building. Stories told to others, reinforced in conversations, repeated until they became identity. I met her gaze without hesitation. And now you know you were wrong, I said. There was no need to push further. No need to list every assumption, every comment, every quiet dismissal they had made over the years. Because standing in that penthouse, surrounded by the reality they had overlooked, the truth didn't need amplification. It only needed space to exist. Karma didn't arrive with noise, and it didn't announce itself the way people expect it to in stories like this. There was no sudden collapse, no shouting, no dramatic breakdown where everything they believed about me was violently replaced in a single instant. It came quietly, in layers, through the slow realization that nothing they had assumed about my life held up anymore when placed against the reality they were standing in. They stood in my penthouse like it was no longer just a space, but evidence. Evidence of everything they had dismissed, underestimated, and misunderstood. My mother kept touching small things, edges of furniture. The glass railing, the surface of a table, as if physical contact would somehow confirm what her mind was still refusing to fully accept. My father had stopped speaking altogether for a while, his silence no longer controlled, but heavy. My sister didn't look at her phone anymore. That detail alone said more than anything she could have said out loud. For years, I had lived inside their version of karma, the idea that I had failed them, that I had walked away from stability, that I had chosen a life that justified their disappointment. They carried that belief like certainty, repeating it in conversations I was never part of, reinforcing it with every assumption they made about my absence. And now, without me needing to raise my voice or defend myself, that entire structure was beginning to collapse. My mother finally spoke, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked again. But this time it didn't carry accusation. It carried something closer to confusion mixed with regret. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Would it have changed how you saw me?" I asked. She didn't respond. Because we both knew the answer. My father shifted his weight slightly, still trying to hold on to something familiar. "We made assumptions," he said slowly, as if the words were difficult to accept even as he said them. "But you also disappeared from us." That word disappeared was interesting. It reframed everything in a way that placed responsibility on both sides, but avoided the deeper truth. I hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped making myself available to a version of connection that required me to shrink myself. "I didn't disappear," I said calmly. "I just stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening." That landed differently. Not as confrontation but as clarity. My sister finally stepped closer to the window again, looking out at the city below. This time, she didn't comment on the view. She just stood there quietly, as if trying to locate where exactly her assumptions about my life had gone wrong. "We told everyone you were struggling," she said after a moment. "We thought we were being realistic." I turned toward her slightly. "You were being confident," I corrected. "Not realistic." That distinction mattered more than it seemed, because confidence without truth becomes assumption. And assumption, when repeated enough, becomes belief. My mother lowered her gaze, her hands resting now without movement. "We didn't see this coming," she admitted quietly. "No," I agreed. "You didn't." There was no satisfaction in saying it. No need to emphasize it further. The reality spoke for itself. Everything they had built around my absence, my silence, my so-called failure, it all existed without evidence strong enough to survive what they were seeing now. My father exhaled slowly, finally looking directly at me again. "So what now?" he asked. It was the first time the question came without expectation behind it. I considered it for a moment. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the question itself had changed. It wasn't about my life anymore. It was about theirs. Now you understand that what you thought you knew was incomplete, I said. My sister turned away from the window, her expression quieter than before. We were wrong, she said, not as an argument, but as recognition. Yes, I said simply. There was no need to expand it further. No need to break it down into every moment, every assumption, every misunderstanding that had led here. Because in that space, with that silence, the truth had already done its work. My mother finally looked at me properly, not as the version she had constructed, but as I was standing in front of her. We raised you, she said, but it sounded less like pride now and more like an attempt to find grounding in something familiar. You raised me, I agreed. But you didn't know me. That difference was the center of everything. For a moment, none of them spoke. The penthouse felt larger in that silence, not because of its space, but because of what it represented. Everything they had assumed about my limits, my choices, my value. It all felt smaller here, compressed by reality. My sister finally broke the silence again, her voice steadier now, but no longer defensive. So what happens to us now? She asked. It wasn't a question about punishment or forgiveness, it was about position. About where they stood in relation to the truth they had just been forced to see. I looked at all three of them, letting the moment settle fully before answering. Nothing happens, I said. Except you leave knowing I was never where you placed me. And that was enough for everything to shift, quietly and permanently. And just like that, the silence in the penthouse stopped feeling heavy and started feeling final. They didn't argue anymore. They didn't question anything else. There was nothing left in their version of the story that could survive what they had just seen, and nothing left in mine that needed their approval to exist. My mother stood first, gathering herself in small, controlled movements, like she was trying to rebuild her composure piece by piece. My father followed without speaking, his silence no longer authoritative, but thoughtful in a way I had never seen before. My sister hesitated for a moment longer, looking once at the city outside the window, then back at me, as if trying to find the version of me she had once laughed at. But there was nothing left to find. I didn't stop them when they turned toward the door. I didn't add another explanation, didn't try to soften anything, didn't reach for closure the way they might have expected. Some truths don't need closure. They only need to be understood once. Their footsteps faded down the staircase, the same path they had taken earlier. But this time, every step carried something different. Not confidence, not judgment, something quieter, heavier. When the door finally closed behind them, the penthouse didn't feel emptier. It felt settled. Because for the first time in a long time, my story wasn't something they defined in my absence. It was something they had finally seen in full.